Welcome to the Schola Equestris podcast, your source for mounted combat and historical horsemanship. I have on the podcast today Jack Gassmann. Jack started in equestrian martial arts with Lakota horse archery back in 2005 and discovered HEMA around 2008. Since then, he has been a successful international competitor, published academic, and worked in the film industry. Most of his horse background comes from buckaroo horsemanship for shows, Rossfechten, and working troubled horses. I recently ran into Jack at Oktoberfest, a local HEMA event here in North Carolina, where he gave a great workshop for HEMAists looking to get into or learn about mounted combat. Although we ran out of time to cross swords, I knew I had to have Jack on the podcast, and so here he is today. Enjoy a wide-ranging discussion all about Rossfechten, his time in the horse stunt world, as well as HEMA in general, and the importance of movement literacy in fencing. All right, so I have Jack with me today on the podcast. I'm super excited to talk to him and tell you all about what he does. Jack, let's start off. I want you to tell me, where are you right now at this moment?
For my sins, I'm currently in Vegas, but I'm normally based in Ireland or Europe. I've just ended up getting a offer of a gig here for doing a stunt show, so I'm trying that out and seeing how things are while film work's a bit slow this winter in Ireland.
Vegas sounds like a much better place to be over the winter, for sure.
But yes.
And were you born in Ireland? Are you Irish?
No, I'm half Swiss, half American. So I spent a fair chunk of my childhood in the UK, another chunk in Kansas, and then my teen and school years in Switzerland. And then 5, 6 years ago, and then I spent a fair amount of time in London doing some film stuff, and then I ended up moving over to Ireland and continuing the film work there.
Wow. So truly multinational, but I see, at home multiple places since you also grew up partially in America where you are now, but you said Ireland is your home. Do you have horses there? You have a farm? Tell us about what you do there.
For the last few years, so we moved early 2018, sorry, late 2018, early 2019 to Ireland, and it was actually my parents moved there first, and then I visited, and then I quite enjoyed it there, and I ended up getting work on a few jobs there, and so I decided to stay. And there wasn't really much of a jousting slash reenactment community there, but there was a lot of Norman history and growing interest in kind of the anniversaries that were coming up around Norman invasions and incursions in Ireland. So I started, me and my partner, we started doing a bit of a company doing live shows and combining a little bit my more theatrical background and horse background with the kind of the reenactment to more do shows that were, rather than straight just joust or reenactment, trying to tell the stories or be more narrative and representative of events and stylized to tell the entire course of a specific history. Like we did one show that was the telling the entire story of the Norman invasion of Ireland in the first like 5, 6 years up to after the siege of Dublin in about 30 minutes, using like jet fights on horseback and stuff and on foot to illustrate the battles. And it was good because it gave people and especially kids a really strong introduction to what happened in a quite a memorable way. Clients really liked it. We started doing the shows summer of 2019. By February 2020, our entire season was booked out, and then you can guess what happened.
And
So
then COVID. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So things have been a bit rough, but we've had the film work also to keep us going. We also we were also training horses and stuff there.
Yeah. So I hear there's obviously a lot of different things that you do on horses, jousting, shows. You spend some time training them yourself. So, what is your favorite thing to do on a horse if you had to pick one thing?
Honestly, I think to me that really depends on the horse. For me, if you're trying to do something that the horse isn't ready for or doesn't enjoy on a horse, it's not going to be a fun time. On the horses that really enjoy Rossfechten, I love some good Rossfechten, especially if they're down for a little bit more getting into it rough and tumble and they understand the game and they understand that this is a game. That's great. I enjoy some on a nice day, some horse archery. I really just enjoy the doing a job and going on having a fun adventure with the horse and that communication. I have to say, but generally it's doing a job with a horse, doing something that's a cooperative exercise, like doing something roping or something. I probably the Rossfechten with the sword stuff. I mean jousting or something. Jousting I enjoy, but I probably enjoy the sword stuff more because there's just a little bit more variety and positioning going on. At least for my taste. Others might disagree.
Yeah, that's spoken like a true horseman to say that it's, and I agree, what the horse likes. And the more the horse likes the task at hand, the better it turns out. And then the more fun it is for you as the rider. For listeners who have not done a lot of Rosfechten, it's almost hard to explain what that is doing it on a horse that really gets the game and knows what you're after and wants to win just as much as you do. But it's a really great feeling that, yeah, it's hard to beat.
Yeah, it turned Rossfechten turns fencing really into a team sport. You have to really understand what your horse's strengths and weaknesses are and really play into those. And like some are very definitely more confrontational, some are definitely more wanting to seed and come in at an angle, some are they're down for anything as long as they're going fast. The others don't want it. Some just don't want to hear anything about the fencing or the swords as long as they're doing their pretty dressage maneuvers perfectly and you're happy about that. They just want to be told, just want that to be appreciated and could take or leave the swords, preferably leave. It all depends, but I think probably for someone who doesn't have much experience with horses are the best way that I can explain them. They're like 400-kilo toddlers with knuckle dusters who are pre-verbal.
Yeah, that's about right.
Like, so if you've ever had to like accomplish a task with a toddler, having a fun time with a toddler, you can have an absolute blast playing with a toddler and doing whatever the toddler wants to do or doing something together with a toddler. But if the toddler doesn't want to do the thing that you're trying to get it to do, and you're trying to, especially maybe even in a professional context, it turns into not so much fun very quickly. And there's always that extra element that you have to be aware of. That there's 400 kilos involved and bad emotional regulation and knuckle dusters. So there's always that extra like safety element.
Yeah. And you also say that with the experience of doing stunt work, which often calls for kind of unusual things that the horse is doing, things that they're obviously trained to do, but still putting them in pretty amped up environments that are very different than what the average backyard horse or average dressage horse certainly is doing. And you've trained some of your own horses to do stunt work too, as well, correct?
Yeah, I've done. We use our horses on some shows, but it's one of the things that I think is really valuable from a historical perspective. Doing stunt work is the fact that you will not off. There's a good chance you won't be using your own horses. The horses you are using for the thing may or may not be actually adequately prepared for the thing, and in some ways you may have to get that job done. When you look at historical records, the amount of times that people are losing horses in battles and having to find remounts, or the remounts are locally sourced and not maybe first picks, there's a lot of that going on. So you also have to stunt work is a lot about also having to navigate and figure out and get a job done very quickly with a horse you might not know, while keeping yourself safe and the horse safe and everybody else around you, except for the things that you agree to do that aren't safe.
Yeah, that's a very good point and something that I think is easy to forget amongst the classical dressage community, right? Where we spend so much time trying to reach that pinnacle of what the horse is capable of doing and what you are capable of doing with them, that it's easy to forget that what's far more realistic is that in terms of warfare and battle, unless you were the best of the best, it's very likely that at some point your horse, you'd lose your horse, you'd have your other horse, and at some point you would be on a horse that was your third, fourth, or fifth choice. And we do, I know, have very good documented evidence of a higher up person in charge, their horse goes down, right, and they take their next person's in line's horse, and that person has to get a new horse and blah blah blah. But realistically, yeah, I'm sure we were putting horses into battle that had much less training than desired, just like we do the same with people, right? That people would be recruited and have just the minimum amount of training they needed with the weapon in the hands they were given and like hope for the best.
Yeah, even the best of the best. We have an excellent example from Busico, the Chevalier Bayard of, I think it was maybe Pavia. One of the ones where his horse goes a bit nutty and decides to charge straight into a pike block, and he throws himself backwards to get to avoid charging into this block of Swiss, and then he belly crawls 3 or 4 miles through a trench to get away from the Swiss because he does not want to get found by the Swiss,
Yeah.
and then ends up finding without a horse, and then ends up finding a random horse on the field that's all cut up, and that's his new horse. But it's got a quirk that every time it sees a drawn sword, it bites it and takes it out of someone's hand. But otherwise, is a great horse, he says. I think there's that added aspect of, yeah, it doesn't matter how, I mean, even the better you are, hopefully, yes, but like things go wrong. It's a military scenario and you have to figure it out. One of the interesting statistics is how many, from Charles the Bold's documents, how many knights had to buy war horses or when they were mustered rather than had them. And the question there is always, did they not have war horses? Or were they like, this is my good horse. This is mine. I do not want to be riding this into battle because the chances of it getting hurt or dying are very high. So I would rather just buy a new one and not give it a name and use that, and then have my excellent horse kept safe. So during peacetime, I can use them for jousting and martial displays and looking good in front of the Duke. And this is just if he comes out of this alive, that's great. If not, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that in some ways it's a difficult decision, right? Because the bond you can have with a horse you really know that you ride all the time, that you've had for years, is very much a special thing. And sometimes that horse will go to bat for you in a way that another won't. But by the same token, we know most of these horses were stallions. And, I'm sure the desire to keep your good horse and breed it later and continue that bloodline was important too.
Yep, I think that's probably a personal decision that everybody had to make, and really was also dependent a little bit on what kind of conflict do you think you might have been going into?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. In the time of year and the environment. Yeah. Thinking to knowing that again, that so much about horses, about combat, HEMA, and yet you spend a lot of time in the show world. What is that trying to like balance that and work with directors or people, entertainers who really want to create a good show and don't care all about history? How do you handle that?
I forget where it's from, but there's an old saying or quote that I saw once, that education should be like a good watch. You only pull it out when someone asks the time. This comes from like the time of pocket watches, I'm guessing, but
Yeah.
it's a professional environment, so you need to first earn trust, and you have to also understand the objectives that the people around you are serving. Like for me, I don't go in with an agenda, and it was a learning curve to subconsciously beat it into my head that that this is a they're looking for specific things, and I have a skill set that has these things, but it's mainly there to create their image. Like what a good example of when I first started doing stage combat, the I was already fairly accomplished team as did fairly ranked fairly highly internationally as a competitor, blah blah blah. And they were doing broadsword, and it was like, okay, so it's basically longsword, and I just naturally started doing more parries, where I was being a bit cheeky and trying to show how I would do it. And the guy teaching it was, God bless him, he actually understood what was going on in a way and was very honest about it. He said, look, that's great, but it's too martial artsy for the character that the director will want. And the thing is, like, there's established products off the shelf that you are brought in to provide.
Yeah.
That are all, unless, and by the time you come onto set, there are so many choices that have already been made about the S and the character. And because what they, as I said, what we want is, we don't want that really nice parry that collects it with the weak and glides it onto the strong and cocks the hip to, like I was doing. That looks too martial artsy. I want you to parry with your sword straight up and arms at a 90-degree to show off the bicep. It gives that more knightly upright kind of jock image. And that's what the character is, and that's what the director is expecting. That's what the stunt coordinator is being brought in to provide. And that's tough if you want it. But on the other hand, I see fencing also from my competitive career as it's a craft. The concept of art in our modern sense didn't exist. When they say Kunst des Fechtens, they do not mean art in how we understand it. It's a craft. Art in the modern sense, it comes from 19th century landed gentry sitting in their parlors making art and then showing it off when they already have income. What Da Vinci was doing was a craft. He was brought in the same way a modern illustrator is brought in to provide a service or a logo or something.
Mm-hmm.
And your job as a fencer is to have your bag of tools, your understanding of your craft, understand what you are supposed to do, and serve the client or the situation as best you can. The same way a carpenter, you may be able to make an absolutely beautiful table with all the scroll work and stuff. But if the client said, look, I want a cabinet that is sturdy enough to hold all these tools and stuff, and it needs to, or just loads of rocks and ore and stuff, and it's going to get banged up. I want you to make it exactly to this size, and it needs to have a drawer this size for this thing. And you just make the table. That's not being a carpenter. That makes no sense. You need to solve the problems that the client is asking you to solve. And the better a craftsman you are, the faster you will do it with more precision and with more finesse. But you have to fit the client's brief. If you're not fitting the client's brief, you're not a craftsman. You're just doing something. And whether it's a tournament which has specific rule sets or a show or whatever, it's my control of my body, my understanding of tempo, distance, opponent, technical knowledge. That's the stuff that I'm being brought in to use, and to use it to create an objective that someone else needs, and if that's to make knights look like high school quarterback jocks with loads of muscles and not too much brains. That's not even a decision I can argue with the stunt coordinator about, because that decision was made already long time ago, probably in the script.
Right. That's very well articulated, and something that I think is very important for any entertainer or someone who provides a service to understand. And as you said, it's whoever is making the aesthetic choices, the higher up writer or developer or whatever, who's making their image of what they think the people want and what's going to be the most entertaining. And at the end of the day, there's a certain public perception of what a knight looks like and what a longsword fight looks like, and whether that or not that is based in truth is irrelevant if the purpose is to entertain. And Not everything has to be perfectly historical. Just look at the world of fantasy literature and fantasy movies and fantasy art that like sometimes we just like things that look cool and that's okay.
It's actually funny because in fantasy, you can get away with being more historical because with historical stuff, there's all these ideas about what a knight is and what they should look like and what history was like, which are mostly 19th century. I can get away with adding actual longsword stuff more often in fantasy or playing an elf than I can doing anything historical. Because fantasy is often a bespoke product where you have leeway, whereas historical implies that's how this is. It's already an established product of what people are expecting to see. And from the producer's point of view, if the audience orders a hamburger and you give it a chicken sandwich, it's a pretty big risk unless you construct your marketing around this is a different kind of historical production and you have an entire devote parts of the script to going why it doesn't look like it normally does. Yeah, and it's changing. Like a lot of this stuff is changing slowly. I was on Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and the armory department was really on point. The guys doing the swords and stuff, they were usually based on historical examples or mished together, and it was really great work. And me and the armorer actually spent time on set nerding out over museum collection books that he had or that I brought along. And the stunt choreographer, the fight coordinator, who he also did Last Duel. We talked a bit about HEMA stuff. He'd been watching HEMA stuff and been interested in it. The work of the community is slowly starting to filter in. But one thing that has to be kept in mind is how we present ourselves has a massive how we present ourselves visually and athletically has a massive influence on that. I Early attempts to bring it into film were often we weren't ready as a community, and we hadn't figured out a lot of the stuff we did, and a lot of our guys didn't have great movement skills. And these are very athletic people, usually in some circles, very athletic, and they can tell immediately if your movement literacy is not 100%. So if you come in trying to make assertions without having the athleticism and proprioception of an Olympic gymnast, you are going to have to be making you're going to have to be very humble. How we present ourselves with how we look with our gear, how we talk about ourselves amongst ourselves has a big influence on whether we look like people who actually know what they're doing and are serious and worth listening to, or just, and generally speaking, if you're going in as a HEMist into production, it's generally best not to mention your background until the previous experience that coordinator has had with HEMA people, and B, until they're already certain of your skills. It's just not a great idea to go lead with HEMA at the moment because of the amount of what has been put out, especially in the last 5 years, as far as content and how other HEMA people have often behaved in going back 20 years.
That's a very good point. And obviously, the HEMA community is diverse, and people's opinions about what HEMA should look like or should be, or what circles it should be tangentially involved in, is people have very different opinions on that. But I'm fully right there with you that if people want to be taken seriously as quote unquote historical sword experts, then they need to act professionally and the product needs to be good. They also need to recognize that we're, as much as we think we know, in my opinion, about HEMA, I still wonder if you took someone from the 15th or 16th century, brought back Vadi, brought back Fiore, and had them look at what we do now, they would be laughing at us.
I think most certainly there's some signposts that we know we aren't hitting, and that I think if we can start moving towards those signposts, we can be a little bit more certain. And I think people completely underestimate how much of a difference it makes to be working athletically and working from a young age. Yeah. We know that they were working with vaulting and basically Olympic pommel horse. We know they were relatively accomplished grapplers. We know, or at least that they were that those things were considered fairly common as a basis, even before moving into the fencing styles we study. We know they were probably had some understanding of horsemanship, and horsemanship, even beyond riding skill, will teach you a lot about fencing and have a large transfer. There's a lot of stuff athletically that I think we just need to be better at understanding and be hitting. Like the fact that we have so few people who started as children is going to make a massive impact, right?
Yeah, I agree. And unfortunately, I don't think that's something that's getting, as someone who's as an orthopedic doctor who sees lots of kids and adolescents, I think our problem with sedentary activity as kids is only getting worse. But no, I fully agree. And as you were just saying that, I was thinking about like Monty and the vaulting section and how you read that now and it just blows your mind that he's talking about being in armor and casually making sure you can vault on your fake horse weekly to keep yourself fit and ready for battle. And the idea of some HEMAist now trying to film that on YouTube is just, we look at it as nearly impossible. And yet he would have not written that if it didn't make perfect sense in his head and wasn't totally conceivable.
Yeah, I think it's also it's about the culture that you belong to, and how much athleticism is just a natural part of, of the culture. If you think about a modern high school wrestling team, I'm pretty sure they would have very few. If you started introducing the vaults to them, it wouldn't be that much of a step. Now we also have to keep in mind, like, not every knight was a physical specimen. There's a large amount of the feudal body that maybe didn't grow up or didn't subscribe to that stuff. But when you're living in a community that where physical prowess is hugely important, I think a lot of things do. That's just not, for a lot of good reasons. That's not really where HEMA started or HEMA is at the moment, but I think it's starting to move there slowly. As to what you're saying about where children are at the moment and where humanity is, as far as like movement literacy, I think that's even more of a reason for HEMA to start thinking about correcting some of those things, and maybe kids classes. If a HEMAist or a HEMA club can make an impact on kids' lives and their physicality for the rest of their lives through the drug of swords, I think that's something very valuable that we should look at doing more often and being better at. Just I that, but that also means I think maybe broadening what we train beyond just longsword.
Right. Oh, I fully agree. I feel very lucky that I'm one of the few human instructors that does get to teach kids. Where I am, we're 14 and up, and it's amazing to watch some of the teens pick up fencing skills that sometimes take adults years to learn, and they pick it up in a matter of weeks sometimes, especially the ones that are highly literate movers. And I stop there and I think, oh my gosh, this kid's been fencing like 2 or 3 years. What is he going to look like in another 10 or 20 if he sticks with this? And he's in his 20s or 30s and has so many years of this under his belt. We all wish we could have had access to that when we were in high school. So why not create it? And I know there are other schools out there that teach teens and kids, and it's a commitment to do that. It takes a lot more effort just to set up your school and do things the right way to make it a good program for kids. But I fully believe that is actually one of my dreams in life is to be able to teach a lot more kids and to see that develop and have it be a family thing for people. I have a few more questions that I really want to make sure we get to. So I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole
Okay,
here.
perfect.
Okay. So I definitely want to talk a little bit more about when you're not in Vegas, when you are in Ireland at your own facility. Do you do some teaching on your own as well?
There's two clubs that I run with a co-instructor in Ireland, and then I travel a fair amount in the US and Europe doing workshops, depending on either more competitive skills or more interpretive stuff, depending on what people are interested in.
And that's both HEMA, say strictly on foot and mounted combat.
I don't tend to do many mounted combat workshops. Sometimes I do boot camps for people who want to come in and learn mounted combat stuff, usually smaller groups in Ireland. But as far as going around and teaching mounted combat workshops, that's not really something I've really gotten into. There's a lot of people, very good people who do that kind of stuff already. I'm happy to leave that for them. My interest usually is more around, there's a lot of like how to integrate either really beginners, getting writers, people who aren't writers into it efficiently. My whatever I'm coaching, usually my mental game is like, how can I get someone from zero to competent as quickly as possible? That's always like my mini game I'm playing in my head as a coach. But I'm in advanced is almost easy to teach in a way. It's usually the getting beginners over the hump efficiently. That's the tricky one.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for people that are interested in really getting their feet wet in mounted combat, say like HEMA people that are already have experience with the sword? How do they get started? Can they seek you out?
They can write me. I'm easy to find on Facebook. But basically, the most important thing that I usually harp on is um, get either going on finding some kind of experience that's 7 days, 12 hours in the saddle somewhere, just trail riding where you're not touching the reins much, or some lessons that are regular, better 2 or 3 times a week for a short time if you can. That's where you're just on the lunge, not touching reins, or in a round pen, not touching reins. Because the biggest mistake problem that people get into, I see, and this is people who've been even riding for decades, is we're monkeys. We're like, we're hugely hand oriented. So anytime anything goes wrong, we try and fix it with our hands. Whereas you need to be able to fix it with your seat and relax. Otherwise, you're just using the reins and the horse's face to balance. And once you've had a couple reps of you've gone into a stress situation and fixed it with your hands on horseback, every time you do that, it becomes exponentially harder to not do that again.
Hmm.
In my experience from teaching people. So if you can just start out with, from the very first, establishing the idea that every time you get in a hairy situation, you you ground into your saddle and ground into your stirrups, and don't clench. If you can get that done, then a lot of other stuff will become much smoother. And
Yeah,
that's
that's
also mobility work, like what you're saying with the kids. A lot of times I find kids pick it up because they're not tight.
yeah,
So
and they
many of these
relax. They're
positions,
not as nervous.
so many of these things that we do in HEMA, people have no concept of that. Actually, they're incredibly mobility oriented.
Yeah.
Same with riding. Like the amount of tightness and things that people can't do because of mobility issues in fencing is huge. So if you can get rid of those things before you start, that's better. Open up your hips, open up your back. You won't, until you can do animal walks and flow works and stuff. Like
Yeah.
until you're loose and strong, you can't really fence.
Yeah. And just to tell the audience, I didn't set you up to say that, okay? Just because I run Sprezzatura that is entirely focused on mobility and developing the strength and agility that people need for fencing. And of course, I started it because I saw such a need for it in the community that, it pains my heart to see people fence that can't get their hands above their head because their shoulders are so tight and their hips don't move. And it is an epidemic for sure. And you also made a very good point. I totally agree about the reins, with the additional thing to say that a lot of people forget. If you go take some horseback riding lessons around your area, most likely you are not going to be I know you're not going to be learning the same sort of techniques that you need for mounted combat, which is one-handed riding, typically with a curb bit, and riding entirely off your seat. And the more you get used to riding off your seat from the beginning and not relying with two hands on the reins, the easier it is to pick up mounted combat later, for sure.
Yeah. If you just, the chances of someone having a good rapport with a local riding professional, if you come up straight to them and say, look, I don't want normal lessons. I want lessons on the lunge or on the round pen free. I don't want to touch your horse's mouth for the first 3 months. The chances of having a good relationship with them where they'll let you do sword stuff later on goes up
Yeah,
by
tremendously.
tremendously, because you're showing respect for the horse and you're showing commitment and you're showing an understanding that this is a living animal and also a resource that you can easily damage without you understanding what you're doing. Like the people who don't ride don't understand how much like you're all constantly teaching the horse, and you're constantly the amount of things you're doing and talking to them and annoying them without you understanding, especially if you is huge. And the less things you have to do, the less things you're going to get wrong.
Yeah.
So it means you're going to learn a small chunk and then improve. If you start out just having to relax on the line, and then you say, okay, I want to just be in charge of speed, of okay, get them from a walk to trot with my own legs, and then rather than the person the instructor doing, and then okay, I want to do all those little things that will slowly improve. You can focus on fewer things and not cause problems for the riding instructor with their horses.
Yeah, that's very wisely spoken and very good advice. I agree. I don't want to take up too much more of your time here, but I have a couple final questions. First off, if you do you have any upcoming events or shows where people can see you ride or joust or anything?
I'm starting work at this job in Vegas, Tournament of Kings, soon. I've just been dealing with paperwork stuff for that. And then as far as that, I don't know. Things are always a little bit up in the air between the different things I do. But if people want to get in touch, they're more than welcome to.
All right. Normally I do my rapid fire questions at the beginning. We're going to do them at the end here. So, how old were you when you actually learned to ride?
When I started sitting on a horse, probably around 7. When I
And
started actually learning to ride,
yeah.
probably 17, 18. I was introduced to like the American kind of vaquero ranch riding tradition, and that was where I got actual horsemanship and riding from, and then branching and bridging more into dressage and classical dressage from there.
Okay. And then where did the mounted combat come in?
Even before that, I had been doing stuff like Roman cavalry shows and messing around on horseback with mounted archery and sword and a little bit of Ross fechten with people, skill at arms and stuff. But there's a lot you can get done with a good horse, good ride, and decent balance and instincts. But I'd still say actual riding is a different thing, or actual horsemanship is a different thing.
Yeah, horsemanship can be defined many ways, but I agree. Last question. If you could go back in time and visit one historical person, horse related or not, who would it be?
I think it would have to be Johannes Lichtnauer, of course, because that's trying to get inside that man's head has been like the last 17 years of my life. So just being able to talk to him and understand what he actually meant and what his life was like would be incredibly fascinating. So yeah, I think either that or any of kind of Cesare Borgia or Machiavelli or any of those kind of guys from around that time would be fascinating. I'd just be fascinated to know what things were actually like and get us spend some time doing butter knives across the dinner table with them.
I agree. Any of those names, but Lichtenauer in particular, yeah. All we are left with is some cryptic verse and what it would have been like to be his student for a week. Sadly, we will never know, but we can dream. Thank you so much, Jack. This was fabulous. We got into some really interesting stuff, both about HEMA and mounted combat, stunt world. I just want to thank you so much for being willing to talk to me and the listeners. And we will have your contact info available if you're okay with that. If
Sounds
anyone
good.
has questions for you or maybe wants to see you the next time you're in Ireland and learn a little bit more about mounted combat.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And if people are interested in me coming over and doing something with them in their Ross Fechten group, I'm more than happy. Most of the stuff I work on tends to be introducing sparring and how to do that, which is an entirely different. It's its own thing. A lot of the same rules apply as on foot, but like teaching the horses that this is a game and that there are rules to it, and how to be involved with it in a safe way is something that takes time and a little bit of, there's some tricks to it.
For sure. For sure. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, my interview with Jack Gassmann. If you're interested in learning more about him, check out the links in the show notes or send me a DM on any of my social media accounts. Please feel free to like, comment, or otherwise spread the podcast to other Horsey HEMA people you think may be interested. Our next episode will be at the end of November after I get back from my trip to Portugal. Unfortunately, I will not be able to take any horses home in my suitcase. However, hopefully I will tell you about the trip on the next episode of Schola Equestris. Thanks for listening.